Hi, I'm Phil Craig.
And I'm Andrew Loney.
And together we aim to bring you the most scandalous stories and some of the most scandalous people in history. So thanks for joining us here on the Scandal Mongers Podcast.
All by myself, don't wanna be all by myself. And come on, Phil, get a grip. It's only a few weeks. And yes, hello, welcome back to the Scandal Mongers. While Andrew is away on his little summer break, it's just me in July and August 2024. Going to do a few episodes all by myself. Yes, well, where is he? I don't really know, if I'm honest. He's doing something quite secret, probably highly scandalous. Maybe one day soon we will find out and share it with you on here. So anyway, while the cat's away, the mice will play, and I'm going to have a nice play today, I hope, by minding the shop. And I have to say, my initial policy of benign neglect to the podcast seems to be working quite well. We've put nothing new up for 2 weeks, but we've had almost as many views on YouTube as we normally do by putting out actual programs. So maybe we're doing something right. The less you see of us, the more you like us. I don't know. We've had I think about 10,000 views a week. It's a little less than we sometimes get, but it's not bad when there's nothing new to watch. So people are still finding the podcast, still subscribing to the podcast, still liking the podcast. And thank you for if you're one of those people. Yes, do like, do share, do subscribe, all the usual stuff. And also, because it's just me, I get to choose the all-important, globally fascinating subject of Comment of the Month. So who is it going to be? Well, I've selected one. And this month, this is the month of June, I guess. The comment's going all the way to Canada. I don't know where in Canada. Somewhere in Canada. To Tracy John. That's Tracy John 826 on YouTube. Hi, Tracy. Thank you for all your lovely comments. There have been so many. I can hardly keep up. But the one you put on the last episode was so nice about how you support the show and enjoy the show. Some interesting ideas about how we might learn more about the royal family through looking at it through the outsiders that have joined it, which is something we've talked about already. And the nice things you said about Andrew, how you're going to miss him, but you hope to stick with me and fully support us going forward. You also wrote something really nice about our Suez episode, which wasn't one of our most popular. But perhaps you liked it because it had a Canadian in it. No, I'm sure you're much more discriminating than that. Anyway, thank you very much for your support and for your comments. Please let me know how to send you one of our wonderful mugs. You can email me on the link in the bio. It should be quite easy to send us an email, and I will get that to you in the post all the way to beautiful Canada. So what else has been happening? Well, we've had an election in Britain. We've yet to see if that's going to make any massive changes to the things that this podcast is really keen to talk about, but we live in hope. We also had quite a big story that was sort of submerged by all the coverage of the election, which touched on something we've talked about here several times, which is the story of Flight 149, the British Airways flight that went to Kuwait at the beginning of the Gulf War all those years ago. I think Norman Baker, the former MP, spoke about it. He investigated it for years in our episode number 53, if you're interested. And more recently, Stephen Davis, the dogged Antipodean investigator, spoke about it as well. And it's essentially a story of a whole lot of people who were taken hostage by Saddam Hussein's grisly regime and subjected to appalling treatment. The allegation is that their plane was allowed to land even though everybody knew the invasion was happening. That's the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait. And the suggestion is that the flight was being used to smuggle special forces into the country, and they were seen as expendable. Now, the government of Britain has always denied this, but over the years there's been lots of juicy allegations and whistleblowing, and it does seem like the full story's never quite come out. Anyway, a group of them, I think about 90, are now formally taking the British government to court. It's going to be quite a big deal. I think people will be required to give evidence who haven't given evidence before. So we'll be following that story and we'll let you know what happens. So yes, what else? Well, I think that's it. I'm allowed to play. So the first thing I thought I'd play with is my interest in the 1920s and 30s. We've done quite a few shows about this era, mostly about slightly debauched British aristocrats, many of whom seem to flirt with fascism. Well, this week's subject didn't flirt with fascism, but she was a slightly debauched aristocrat. Well, an American version of aristocracy, I suppose you could say. She was a Guggenheim, Penny Guggenheim, who led a truly scandalous but also really important life. Certainly if you're interested in art, but not just art, the way that people lived, the way people could write, the way people could speak and express themselves, it really did transform in the 1920s and 30s movement that I guess at the time was called Modernism. She was at the heart of it, living a very public life, very different kind of life, unconventional life, during which she worked with, married, slept with, helped, promoted, launched some of the most famous artists of the 20th century. A really interesting woman. And Mary Dearborn, who wrote a great biography about her, has agreed to talk to me about it. So without further ado, let's go talk to Mary. Oh, I should just say there'll be nothing next week. I'm going to be doing one every 2 weeks through the summer or winter, if you're in the Southern Hemisphere. And then Andrew will be back at the beginning of September. So there'll be nothing from me for a couple of weeks. But I hope you enjoy Peggy, and I will be back with you before the end of July. Thanks a lot. Welcome, Mary. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you.
It's some years ago I read your biography of Peggy Guggenheim, and I was reminding myself of some of the reviews as I sort of prepared for this conversation. And somebody said, a wonderful blend of the salacious and the serious. And I thought, that's kind of what we're trying to do with this podcast too. So we're probably going to get on very well.
I think salacious is too judgmental a word. I would completely agree with the impulse behind it, but salaciousness is not a bad thing.
Well, I mean, you wrote a book, and we'll talk about it in detail, that makes a very strong case for how important Peggy was in the history of art and culture. But you also chose a slightly sexy title. Let's be honest, The Mistress of Modernism.
Oh yes, my view of gossip or scandal is maybe different from a lot of people's. That I think biographers would recognize it, because so much of what we do could be called gossip. Now, gossip is not a bad thing. Philip Rose said that, she wrote a book called Parallel Lives about 5 Victorian marriages. And she said looking at gossip marriages are about power relationships between 2 people. And gossip was nothing more than looking at relationships like that are very important, that tell us a lot about ourselves, and not to mention being the only way sometimes you can get at someone's life. I think Peggy's being a mistress is just as important as her being of modernism.
No, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, she had the most amazing life. It's hard to sort of explain how kind of much part of the elite she was. I know she was one of the poorer Guggenheims, but she must have been, we talk about the 1%. I mean, she was part of the 0.1%, wasn't she, when she was born?
Yes, she really was, except being one of the poorer Guggenheims, that was kind of significant. I mean, her wealth was, we should all have such problems, but her wealth was really a curse in so many ways, because it affected her relationships with everyone. And nobody could believe that she didn't have millions and millions of dollars. And like her closest friends, like Juna Barnes, they couldn't, and Emma Goldman, they could not understand why Peggy wouldn't, give them millions of dollars. And, she was a warm-hearted person, and it just seemed incredibly stingy. And they seem to have no conception that not everybody, you don't automatically get given a lot of money, but B, that Peggy didn't have it.
So what was her childhood like? I mean, we talk about the Gilded Age, and this, I guess she was born right in the middle of it.
Oh, she was. She lived right off Fifth Avenue, and her mother was a real kind of Liberty Gibbet. Is that the word? Yes. Eccentric, and who was only concerned about when it came to raising girls, was only concerned about who they would marry. And Her husband was famously unfaithful, but Peggy went to, an exclusive girls' small, I don't even think you'd call it a school. It was, well, yes. And she had a debut, but she also had one teacher, Lucille Cohn, who took it upon herself to raise Peggy's consciousness that she wasn't the only, that there were many, there was 99% more people that Peggy needed to know about. And for some reason that really took. I mean, she was a smart cookie, Peggy, even then. So at that point, and then she came under a bunch of influences that attracted her to the more bohemian side of life. But between having a social consciousness and wanting to lead a more interesting life than a debutante socialite, she was launched on a very different kind of life from what her mother envisioned for her, wanted for her.
So her father's death, famously on the Titanic, what is she, 14, 15? That must have been a very, very shocking and life-changing moment. How did it really affect her kind of development, do you think?
Well, I think that she felt she didn't spend a lot of time with him, but I think that she felt that her father was one of the few people on the earth who was sympathetic to her and understood her problems. And I think it was just such an incredible shock. I mean, what would be the equivalent now? Down planes are too commonplace. It was, it was something that was just, I'm afraid to, I mean, it's more on the order of September 11th. I mean, it was a major worldwide event. And I think that she was so shocked. And then the whole question of how the family would get along and the fact that he didn't leave a lot of money, because her father left the family firm, the Guggenheim brothers, and he still had a lot of money, and he was himself a pretty good businessman, but he didn't have the fortune that the other Guggenheims had.
So when I forget actually when she first goes to Europe, is she a young woman or still a teenager? And is this when she really starts to develop this interest in art and then, of course, artists?
Yeah, she went at in her early teens for a tour of Europe, a grand tour, and she not in her early teens, after her father died, so mid-teens, late teens, and she had memorized the classic art history book, apparently, and she couldn't get enough of the old masters. That's who she was seeing. As of course, I don't think she laid eyes on a piece of modern art then at all. And then she went over as a young woman, married to Lawrence Vail, her first husband, who was himself quite a bohemian. He came from a kind of international family, Americans, but who lived in Europe for a couple of generations. And Lawrence Vail's father was a painter, and Lawrence, he was very good looking, and he had long blonde hair. Okay, that's strange then. Not, shoulder length, but still not. And he never wore a hat, which is hard for us it's for that to register now, but it was really, really unusual. And that just thrilled her. And Lawrence was just as iconoclastic as she was, and she thought living with him would be great fun. And there's the famous story of her seeing a frieze of an art frieze showing all kinds, Egyptian, I believe, showing all kinds of exotic sexual positions, and asked whether Lawrence could show her those. And when he said yes, then she knew he was the man for her. So early on, she's sexually curious, right? I mean,
and was it an open marriage? I mean, there was some people on the avant-garde side of life, even then, had open marriages. Was that one of them, or wasn't it?
no, no, and it was a tempestuous marriage, and in fact, Lawrence, it got violent sometimes, and he hit Peggy, but also he would his favorite way to punish her for some reason was rubbing jam in her hair.
Oh my goodness.
And she found that extremely humiliating, which I guess it would be. It can't be pleasant to have jam rubbed in your hair. But no, he was that wasn't the issue. Infidelity, it was I'm sorry about the phone.
Oh, no worries.
Okay.
I can't hear it anyway.
Let me close this door.
We're used to things like this happening on our podcast.
What are you doing?
I say it's very common to get a delivery, isn't it, or something like that?
Yeah, I'm sorry, though. I should have foreseen it.
No worries.
Anyway, Lawrence, it was a tempestuous marriage, and Peggy, it became more and more oppressive to her, and it started to come apart, and it was an incredibly difficult time for her. Meanwhile, they'd had 2 children, but I'm sure we'll get to the children. But she knew she had to leave Lawrence, and it was a very strange summer when she left him. She had formed an unlikely friendship with Emma Goldman, the anarchist, and just extremely unlikely, a totally different person. She was Jewish, but she was a Russian Jew, and Peggy was a very, upper crusty German Jew, and or had become so in this country. And Emma Goldman gave her cottage in the south of France, and Peggy took refuge there.
I love the idea of an anarchist with a cottage in the south of France.
Yes,
very
right.
Very good.
Called Bonnie Day. I'm just like, it's not your image of Emma Goldman. And Peggy had arranged for Emma to get the money to rent this little cottage, and just generally helped Emma out. But it was a very difficult summer for Peggy. And she and Emma, unfortunately, ended up having a terrible falling out. Let me just, because it's emblematic of the problem about her not having money. But they were very close, Emma and Peggy. But Peggy felt that Emma was writing her autobiography then, and Peggy does not figure into it, though the cottage in the south of France does, but nothing about this terrible thing that Peggy was going through. And meanwhile, Emma felt Peggy should be supporting her. And this, though she got her this cottage, that persisted. And Emma, said, "You've got all this money. Why don't you support me?" And Peggy'd say, I don't have that money, and I can't. And besides, you're not very grateful. So, in other words, on the other side, people expected her to support them. But on the other side, and this happens with people who have money, is they get resentful that they're not, others are not grateful enough to them, no matter what their intentions. That it's really it's very sad. You'd call it tragic if it were not for, the wealth. In other words, the human relationships are almost doomed.
Yeah, that's interesting. I remember years ago at university, my thesis was on Joyce. And he's one of these European artists who was always on the lookout for a wealthy American patron. ideally a woman. And he took lots and lots of money off these people, and he used it in return for writing a very, very, very small amount of his frankly unreadable Finnegan's Wake. And he was just a scrounger, but a lot of artists and writers were, and always have been, I guess.
Sure. By the way, Giorgio Joyce, James's son, was one of Peggy's conquests.
Oh, really? I did not know
Yes.
that. Oh, I did not know. We should get to Peggy and Art now, because
we will.
does this happen when she's in France the first time? Because I think she lives between France and London, doesn't she, for a while?
Yes, and I'm not sure at what juncture she slept with Giorgio, but yeah, she went to London and opened a gallery there in the 30s called Guggenheim Jeune. And it was named that because to distinguish it from her uncle Solomon Guggenheim, who had started a museum back in the States, and of course would go on to become the Guggenheim, who started the Guggenheim Museum. And Peggy wanted to show that she was much more iconoclastic than her uncle was. And she started collecting. I mean, she started showing all kinds of avant-garde artists, and, got in trouble with the authorities. And it became a very not financially successful, a very notorious gallery. And in the meantime, she was making the acquaintance of just all these artists who were her favorite people. She felt that since she wasn't artistic herself, I was wondering the other day if she ever tried seriously to be an artist herself, but she would have, I think, if she had an ounce of talent, but probably couldn't draw a straight line or whatever.
So forgive my lack of command of the various schools of avant-garde art, but are we talking now Expressionism, abstract Expressionism? What are we talking, the 20s and early 30s? I'm looking over your shoulder at that kind of thing.
Oh,
That's
yeah.
the sort of art we're talking about, are we?
Yeah, it wasn't. It was high modernism. Okay, that was when the big guys, the big heavy hitters, were becoming well known. So they were people like Yves Tanguy, Picasso, de Chirico, Magritte, most of whom she showed in her London gallery. And then later she became, the London gallery was successful, and she knew that she had found her milieu. Absolutely. She was, she hit 40 in here, the age 40, and Peggy's a real life begins at 40 kind of girl, because that's when her life really began. She was free of Lawrence and on her own, and her life just started opening up. And it was started with this London gallery, but also knowing artists and surrounding herself with artists. And that was what she did for the rest of her life, for good or ill.
Well, you've mentioned some incredibly famous names already. Did Peggy discover these people, or did she just simply promote and boost them?
Well, that's one of my favorite, very naive or observations, or a truism, which Peggy got a lot of guff for her. She wrote 2 autobiographies, and they were about, the first one was about her. Well, they were autobiographies, so they were about her entire life, but they also were about the artists that she knew and the artists that she slept with. And Peggy was accused of being a name dropper, because it's Tanguy, Calder, Brancusi. And my truism, or the naive observation, which is nonetheless true, is that they weren't famous then. They're just like an artist that you or I know, you thought they were great, but you had no indication of what they were going to be. And so when they became well-known or famous, and even then they weren't as famous or as enshrined in the pantheon as they are now, even then she can't be the she was a little bit proud of that. I knew him when, I slept with him when. And so and she loved that. So I don't begrudge her a bit, using those names in her autobiography. And, she didn't exaggerate. It's not like she made up for her
Did
conquest.
she obviously had lots of lovers, but was there any artist that she was really kind of passionately in love with, who was the dominant love of that period, or was it all a little bit more kind of comme ci, comme ça, easy come, easy go?
She fell in love, I think, a couple of times, and one, strangely enough, was not a visual artist. It was Samuel Beckett, the writer, the avant-garde writer. And he, again, was not famous then. He was really struggling, and he was writing this kind of...
Another protege of Joyce, of course.
Yes, right. He'd been Joyce's secretary, in fact. And he was writing a kind of what seemed inaccessible prose, and he was not getting traction. And he met Peggy, and they had an affair. And people tend to write this off. Beckett was so brilliant, obviously. He wanted her money or something like that. But I really think it was a great love affair, because they had exactly the same sense of humor. Like she had a very satirical, fast, clever mind, and of course Beckett did, and they shared a kind of worldview. But the real evidence, I thought, was so I think they recognized each other, and they're like, oh my God, this might be the love of my life. I have more in common with this person. But then they kept breaking up and then getting back together, and breaking up and getting back together. And I just have always thought that, you do that when you're broken up. You say, oh, geez, I'm never going to find a person who knows me that well. So I thought I am sure that was a really big love affair in her life. And there were a couple, but she also married, of course, famously married Max Ernst, the German surrealist painter.
Was that after Beckett or before or during?
No, this was after. And it was after she slept with a lot of these artists. One of the things that Peggy was able to do was not only get her artworks out of Europe, but also to arrange to get many of the artists out of Europe in World War II, at the beginning of World War II. And Max Ernst was one of them. And that's when they married. And he was, they were in love with each other to begin with. But Max Ernst rather quickly moved on, in his head anyway. And she came to New York with him, again, fleeing Europe, and they stayed married for a while, but it didn't end well. Max got interested in someone else, and I think Peggy had expected that and was in love with Max, and was disappointed, but I think was not totally surprised.
So you mentioned her children earlier. America was quite a straight-laced place in the 30s, and all this slightly scandalous behavior going on in Europe. I mean, were they cross about this, or did they understand, or what was their relationship like with their mum? Now she's living her best life after the age of 40.
They didn't disapprove of any. They might have been embarrassed, the way one is embarrassed about a parent's sex life, but I think even they probably liked that. That was probably, but it was not an easy childhood. And not so much because of Peggy's personality or her parenting style or the divorce, the fact that her father, that they split up and her father had gone on to marry Kay Boyle, the writer Kay Boyle. But just the way children of the very rich have it really hard. I mean, you probably know some, and they were brought up mostly by caretakers, and Peggy would be, I suppose, at first a glamorous presence, and maybe later something of an embarrassment. And they grew up too fast. They went to a progressive. He went to, is it Bedales? Is that how you pronounce that?
Bedales.
Yes, thank you. Which was fairly progressive then,
right? A posh British school, which was seen as being very progressive.
Yes, right. And Peggy was an artist. Peggy had natural talent. She was a primitive painter, and Peggy really grew up too fast. And they were kind of a mess. And Peggy more so than her son was named Sinbad, which I always found very strange. But Sinbad had a bit of an easier time of it. But they were adolescents when Peggy was in England. And for some of the time she was in England, Peggy was involved with this one man, John Holmes, who was one of those famous great writers. Everybody thinks he's a great writer who never really wrote a word. And she holed up with John Holmes was his name in the English countryside, and it was difficult for them. I remember both of them at school. There being confusion in the school administrations. This was before Bedales. By the fact that Peggy wasn't married, or that she wasn't married to the man she lived with, and that probably embarrassed them hugely. So anyway, they had a tough time growing up.
So Peggy, the war, the 50s, Jackson Pollock comes along, I think is another significant figure in Peggy's life.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, she by now she really is one of the more important figures in the international art world, isn't she?
Well, when World War II broke out, Peggy decided that she was partly about Peggy and money. She was also quite frugal, cheap, right? And she, when World War II broke out, she saw that the artists all were having trouble, and she could get artworks from them very cheaply. And she went around, she called it that she was buying a picture a day. And it was pretty much a picture. Buying a lot of art in a very short time at very low prices. I mean, I found a price list from back then, and there are things like a Picasso for $250, it's in my book. There's a chart, and anyway, so she started amassing this wonderful collection. And then when she came to New York, she opened a gallery there that was just incredibly influential. And there she gave first shows to a lot of the abstract expressionists, most notably Pollock. And this is when you start to see how brilliant she really was, because she could see, talk about not being famous then, but she could see Pollock then wasn't doing the drip painting. He was doing this very early kind of muddy, ugly paintings that are very hard to love. Once you I love them now, and a lot of people do, but it's very hard to like them. And Robert Motherwell and Mark Rothko and Clifford Still, and she picked them all, and they became a real, she
Well, that's an entire school of art there, isn't it? I mean,
Yes, yes.
that is the 50s and 60s in art, and she seems to have kind of kick-started it. Amazing.
Well, she really did. And, you have to understand the center of the art world was Paris, just unequivocally, right? Because that's where all the big modernists were, and Picasso and all of them. And because of Peggy's gallery and because of Peggy's really directly attributable, the center of the art world changed from Paris to New York, where, it stayed for the next 50 years anyway. Some people still say it's the center of the art world, though London certainly had its day. And she was really, her gallery was really single-handedly where that happened. And there has to be, she wasn't just lucky, she was a genius. She had a really good eye. I've always wondered, again, it's sort of a naive observation or a truism, is would somebody like Pollock have been, if Peggy hadn't come along, did geniuses always get recognized? I don't know. And certainly she succeeded in numbers, a lot of them.
So she's getting older now. She's in her 50s. Is she still throwing herself into love affairs with the old enthusiasm? Yes. She is?
Oh, yes. And she's slowing down a little because of the lack of demand on the men's part, but no, just a little. And still falling in love. She was in love during when she had the gallery there with a British, I don't know how you describe him. His name was Kenneth McPherson, and I think he ended up becoming a CIA agent, but he was gay. And then, that became a kind of motif, that there were gay men that Peggy fell for. And then, toward the end of her life, she ran into a lot of gigolos, but she didn't really fool herself that there was that much more to them.
So did you I always ask this of biographers, did you end up liking her more or less when you finished your work on her life?
I much more. I'd read her autobiography. She was in Paris in the 1920s, and I tend to write about, I have some other subjects who lived in Paris in the 1920s, great period, right? And I'd read her autobiography, and I just thought, oh gosh, she was used and abused by a lot of men, because even throughout, even though she had a bad nose, and people would make fun of that, and she was very attractive, but it was she had this sort of angular grace. But she wasn't conventionally good looking at all. And people made fun of that. People, and the same thing about, oh, it's her money, and anybody wants to be with her, it's for their money. And I didn't see, I wasn't aware, I didn't know that much about art history. I really and I didn't see how important, how absolutely pivotal she was. And then her life became, I just respond. You look at anybody really closely and you respond to them, and I think I wrote a biography of Hemingway, and he was really a mess, he was a mess, but I got very protective of him. I wouldn't say fond of him. And I was protective about Peggy too, didn't like it when people wrote her off. And what I guess you'd call that. I liked her. I had a lot of respect for what she did. And then I responded to her as a person. I felt like I knew her. I always get to that point.
Did it change the way you look at art? Have you been buying any masterpieces recently that we should know about?
No, but absolutely. I've become a real appreciator of art. And I'd like to, there's a couple of book ideas I have about artists. It totally that added a new dimension to my life. I've never seen this before, but kind of like it did to Peggy. It was like, whoa, it's like some people discover music in their, whatever. So, yes.
Well, I'd love to know more about your other books, because the 1920s, especially in Paris, is an amazing period. And maybe we should talk about Hemingway one day.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, yeah, there's, and talk about scandals there. It's just rife with them. It's a very rich period. Another line about gossip that I liked was, I got a contact. Peggy was in Venice for from age 50 odd on. And it was very, I don't know, I think admirable thing to do. She gets older and she takes all her pictures with her and buys a palace in Venice, and sets up there. And it was a good life. But I finally found somebody I heard of someone in the art world who was married to someone in the art world who was willing to talk about Peggy's life in Italy and Venice. And it was a friend's mother and a friend of a friend's mother. And I called her up and she said, "Why, Mary?" She said, "I have lots of things I could tell you, but I can't because they're just gossip." And I'm like, yes, that's what I do. It's
That's what we all do. And we've said before, actually, on this podcast, today's gossip is the subject of the content of the Pulitzer Prize winning biography of 5 years' time.
Yeah, it's history too.
It is history. Well, this is such a great conversation. I'm looking at my clock, and I'm such a cheapskate. I only have cheap soon. So I'm gonna thank you and say goodbye. But what a great joy, and I really do appreciate your time.
Oh, thank you. And send me a link when you.
I will do that, and I'm going to come back to you. We'll talk about Hemingway.
Okay, sounds good. All right, thanks, Phil.
Many thanks, Mary. All the best.
Okay,
Bye.
Thank you for listening to the Scandal Mongers podcast. This has been a Podcast World production. You can get in contact with our show by emailing team@podcastworld.org, placing Scandal Mongers in the heading, or via our social media links within the show's bio.